Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where my guest is our Louisiana Congressman Garret Graves. Congressman Graves is going to talk to us about a very important tax bill that is currently pending in front of President Trump, and it's to help the flood victims. He's going to talk to us about the National Flood Insurance Program, the deadline coming up at the end of this month, and he's also going to talk to us about $8 billion that's been collected so far for state of Louisiana and residents, but only $100 million of $2 billion has been passed out by the state. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Congressman Garret Graves.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my Legal Lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith: make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and I'm very pleased to have back on our show our Louisiana Congressman Garret Graves. Garret, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
Know you've been working hard and blowing and going, and kind of wanted to get an update for everybody. You know, a lot of big issues going on in Louisiana and nationally and internationally, but let's dive into kind of one of the most tragic events, and that's the big flood, great flood of last year. Tell us kind of what's going on.
Well, first of all, as you know, we had a number of problems with FEMA and other federal agencies we were working on, and felt like we were somewhat of a voice in the wilderness. But
Truly.
Having Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Maria and Nate, Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, all took some really hard hits as a result. And a lot of the problems they're experiencing are things that we experienced or are still experiencing in Louisiana. So we now have a lot more allies. We've been able to, when you pull together flood insurance and all the other federal assistance, somewhere approaching $8 billion in federal funds for recovery. We've been able to make
for Louisiana,
$8 billion
yeah, for Louisiana.
$8 billion just for Louisiana for those floods we had in 2016. We've been able to move legislation forward through the House that repeals this duplication of benefits issue. There are an estimated 18,000 people in Louisiana that applied for SBA loans that then are boxed out of getting the Restore Louisiana program grants. There are people who believe that a grant is duplicative of a loan or vice versa, which clearly makes no sense at all. So we're moving legislation that would allow people who got loans through SBA to be able to get a grant to either pay that loan off or cover other losses that haven't been covered to date. So a lot of progress being made, but I'll tell you, it's really unfortunate. But thrusting some of these issues into the forefront in Texas and Florida and other states is really what helped us to solve some of these problems. So things really are moving forward. I'll also say, though, that unfortunately, of the nearly $2 billion in federal funds we've been able to provide to the state to fund the Restore Louisiana program, only about $100 million of that has been handed out
now,
to date.
What in the world is the explanation for that? $100 million out of $2 billion?
Yeah, Locke, there's not a good reason, there's not a good excuse. You can point to a lot of different things: lack of preparation, didn't have a contract in place, failed to get applications and database in place fast enough, things along those lines. I think that the federal government has some blame or culpability in that the process requires way too much information, way too much detail, in some cases 50, 60, even 70-page reports per home.
Per home?
Per home. On the state side, again, not having a database in place, not having sharing agreements, not having a contractor in place, really just missed opportunity with the months leading up to the initiation of this program. And unfortunately, I feel like that the program is just being run too slowly by the state at this point. But we are working. We had brought the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development down here to meet with the state and talk about ways to expedite things. We're continuing to work on some efficiencies to try and get the money into the flood victims' hands as quick as we can.
So whose fault is it? I mean, you said it's federal and state, and I know I'm not trying to necessarily fight, but I'm trying to figure out where are the problems and how. And I know you're trying to fix them, and it seems like you're moving in that direction.
Look, I think that there's the blame within HUD, and that I think they require too much detail and documentation. I think that some of the reports and the timelines in terms of getting these applications approved, I think that takes too long. My personal opinion, I think the majority of the problem lies with the administration of the Restore Louisiana program. I think that they were not prepared. Keeping in mind this flood happened in August, they had everywhere from August until when they started this program in the April-May timeframe to get a contractor on board, to collect information on flood victims, to learn who still had unmet needs, and to really design the administration of this program. And unfortunately, we've seen a small percentage of the dollars handed out, despite the really significant amount of lead time that they had to really get this program right and in place and move quickly.
And is that because the state doesn't have the information that the federal government requires for them to release the monies?
In some cases, yes. And of course, there's that issue that many of the flood victims, they don't really fully appreciate that in some cases they might have applied to SBA, a Small Business Administration, at one point, which makes loans to individuals, not just businesses. They might have applied to flood insurance program at one point. They might have applied to FEMA at one point. And all these people know and say, wait a minute, I've already applied 3 different times.
Right.
You tell me I need to apply a 4th time? And so some people are just done and frustrated, but there's way too much bureaucracy. I think that there could have been much better data sharing early on that would have prevented all of these redundant applications and repetitive filings. We have passed some legislation through the House that helps to clean that up. We've put legislation, it's actually been signed into law today, that puts a lot of this information online so people don't have to fill out paper applications. They can just do it all online. have a status report online where they don't have to call 800 numbers and things like that. So we are making some improvements, but I think it was largely a lack of preparation on the state side that have led to these delays. But we're continuing to work together state and federal level to help clean things up.
I know that the National Flood Insurance Program, I believe there is a proof of loss deadline that lapses December 31
this year. That's
of
right.
this year.
Yeah.
So if you got insurance and you're presenting a proof of loss, that's D-Day from what I understand.
That's correct, and it's so we've been able to extend the deadline. As I recall, we're hitting right up against 500 days, which is a pretty substantial amount of time, but it is important for everyone, as you well know, being an attorney, that if you have losses, you have got to have that information submitted by the end of the year to be eligible.
Excellent news that you guys, on the House side and Senator Cassidy and Kennedy's have gotten provisions in this tax bill that looks like we're going to finally get that helps us flood victims. Tell the folks about that.
Well, so we had filed legislation earlier this year. Then Congressman Bustani had filed legislation that provided tax relief right now under the tax code. You're not allowed to get tax relief until you cross over a 10% threshold of your adjusted gross income. So if you're making $50,000 a year, you can't get a deduction from your losses until you cross over $5,000 in damages. So that's one thing that we found just problematic, is all the great losses people had here. So we've been able to work language that would eliminate that threshold for our flood. Number 2, many people tap their retirement accounts and use those to help get back in their homes and businesses as quickly as possible. The only resources some people had. We've been able to work language in the bill that would eliminate the penalty for tapping your retirement income early, and allowing folks to stretch the income over 3 years. And what I mean by that is that if you take that lump sum payment and put it on your tax return in 1 year, it's going to elevate your tax bracket and your tax rate.
Makes sense.
But what this would do is allow you to stretch it out over a few years. Therefore, you don't have that 1 year high tax rate, high tax burden. A few other little cats and dogs, but definitely trying to help the folks keep more of their own money if they're using it to help get themselves back in their homes and back in their business.
So there was employer credits somehow provided, or may be provided along with helping charities?
That's right, and just recognizing the role that many of the employers played, number one, in the job losses that they had. Number two, the casualty losses that they had, so helping to provide some incentives to them to get back into their businesses and rewarding that type of behavior, and also charitable deductions. And we also passed legislation through the House that allows for food banks and others to be able to be eligible for assistance.
Okay, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with our Louisiana Congressman Garret Graves. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Again, very pleased to have back on the show our Louisiana Congressman Garret Graves, who's for District 6. Garret, let's dive back in. You talked about the state has gotten, and individuals, $8 billion, but you've also been successful getting, what, another $13 billion possibly?
Well, we're still working on that, working that money through the process. We have been meeting with the White House and trying to explain to them that even though the money is being handed out very slowly by the state, we still have additional needs above the projected $8 billion that the state and its citizens have received so far. So in the president's budget request to the Congress, he asked for approximately $13 billion in additional funds, of which Louisiana would be one of the top eligible states. We're trying to work in the Congress right now to further refine that, to tighten up the eligibility to where really Louisiana and maybe some of these hurricane-hit states would be the only states eligible, but this would be on top of the several billion dollars we've been able to get in federal funds so far, just to help our recovery, but not just recovery, Locke, making us stronger. We think it's really important we don't build back the way we were. We build back the way we want to be. We build back more resilient. We build back stronger and allow us to move forward on important flood projects like Comey and others.
And as I understand it, Garret, the $13 billion was going to be used to kind of help schools and infrastructure be recreated, maybe help the charity system, and that's because the existing system through FEMA didn't really provide for that, disallowed that, right?
Well, in regard to the schools, there is they call it a deductible, but basically, if a school is in a floodplain and doesn't have flood insurance, then FEMA effectively penalizes each building or structure within a school to the tune of $500,000. So you may have a school that has 10 buildings on it. It may have a high school, they have a gymnasium, it may have a lunchroom. Each one of those buildings, if it has 10 buildings, each one of those buildings costs $500,000. So you have a deductible of $5 million. And Locke, where this really gets challenging is that most of our schools in this area are funded by a millage or property tax. Well, property values have gone down, particularly in areas like Livingston Parish that had such pervasive flooding. And so your property values have gone down, your income's going down, but you're putting these multi-million-dollar penalties on top of it. In fact, if I remember right, I think in Livingston Parish alone, they were looking at like a $24 million payment for all of these school damages.
A deductible.
Deductible. And so we're working on getting additional dollars to help cover some of those costs and allow these schools to get back in business.
You brought up, we don't want to repeat the problems of the past, and you and I were talking before the show. I had 6 properties flood. Not one of them was in the flood zone according to the FEMA maps. How do we fix this craziness?
Well, first we have to recognize this was a really just an amazing storm, a 1,000-year storm by some projections. But it is important for people like you, for people who have just one house, one business. We've got to make sure that we're giving people the confidence to reinvest that insurance check, that Restore Louisiana check, back in their homes and businesses and come back to the capital region. And so by building back stronger, building projects like the Comey project that are lowering our flood risk in this area, those are important complementary investments to our recovery. And that's why we've been pushing those so hard. We've been able to date to get approximately $300 million in hazard mitigation grant program funds. We've been able to increase tenfold the amount of Corps of Engineer dollars for the Comite project as well, working to move important flood mitigation projects forward concurrent with some of the other rebuilding efforts.
I've read about the Comite diversion. We're, what, 35 years after this idea first being proposed and purportedly supported? I mean, is that ever going to happen realistically?
Based upon the dollars that the state has available today, that project absolutely should be built. I think it can be completed within 2 or 3 years.
Really?
It is going to take some will on the part of the state. They're going to have to prioritize this, but we've been able to knock down a number of obstacles that were in the way. We've been able to get some additional Corps of Engineers funding.
That'd be such great
but
news,
Locke,
Garret.
look, let's just reiterate what you said. Can you imagine if you had a client and you went to them and they came to you and said, Locke, look, I need you to do this. And you said, you bet, I'll be back to you in 35 years. How long would you be in business? Yet, and you shouldn't be.
That's right.
But that's exactly what the federal government's doing through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in this project. This process is so fatally flawed, and that's why I'm excited as we work with the president on a new infrastructure package that we're able to come in and entirely transform or revolutionize the way that we deliver infrastructure projects and stop this absurdity of leaving projects in the process for 35
Well, I
years.
remember former Senator Vitter, David, talking about how the Army Corps of Engineers just drove him out of his mind. I think it's pretty much causing you the same problem. So how do we fix those guys? Because, I mean, I think I was reading the Morganza spillway kind of process it's just absurd.
Yeah, on that project, they spent $80 million and haven't put a shovel in the ground. The Morganza project in Terrebonne Parish and portions of Lafourche. This isn't a single project where just the Comite project, they've done this. It's across the board. The West Shore project in St. John Parish and surrounding areas, they've studied it for 42 years before they finished the study.
And they're studying it for impact studies? Like, well, how is this going to hurt everything else? Like, you mean the floods?
Exactly, and whether they should move forward. I mean, look, it's nonsensical. So I think the solutions largely lie in first of all, taking the Corps of Engineers out of the Department of Defense. Why is our flood agency in the military?
Makes no sense.
I understand how it evolved this way. It goes back to George Washington and the surveyors and things like that. And I understand that made sense, but the evolution and this mission creep that's occurred over decades and decades, it's gone too far. It needs to be administered a different way. I think the Department of Transportation, the Department of Interior would be a better house for the Corps of Engineers mission. Under the Department of Transportation model, they grant the funds to the states. When I was working for the state of Louisiana on these issues, we were able to repeatedly build Corps of Engineer projects for 1/3 the cost estimate that the Corps of Engineers
Isn't that
had,
a shocker?
and in a fraction of the time.
I mean, it's so we know that the bottleneck, and you guys are focused on that, and you got a president in President Trump that sure seems to have no problem shutting down regulations.
He's willing to flip tables over. He is.
Well, that's good news. Talk about the coastal erosion stuff that's going on, because obviously this all fits together.
It absolutely does. And so, the good news is that when you look back over the last 8 years or so, we've made more progress on our coast in that period of time than any multi-decade period in our state's history. So things are moving in the right direction. The bad news is we still have a long way to go. The state this year put together a 50-year, $50 billion coastal plan. We're working on getting additional funding for the state. We had introduced legislation in 2015 that provides about $100 million a year for the state of Louisiana in coastal restoration funds through a multi-agency program. That was, we were able to attach the bill to a larger one. It's been signed into law. There's offshore energy revenue sharing called the Gulf of Mexico
Big deal.
Energy Security Act. For the first time in decades and decades, the state starts getting a real share of those revenues. President Obama tried to cut it. President Trump tried to cut it. We've been able to fight it off, and those dollars will be rolling into the state, albeit at a little bit lower level right now.
But that's hundreds of millions of dollars, is it not?
It will be hundreds of millions of dollars over several years' time, and so that'll be contributing. So we've got a number of revenue streams. Of course, the BP settlement will be delivering hundreds of millions of dollars annually as well. So many sources of revenue coming in. We're making extraordinary progress. I think the state's projected to spend somewhere between $500 and $600 million on this year alone.
One thing I always get concerned about, though, is every time we send money to Washington, if they send it back to us, it's with all kinds of strings attached. Is that still the problem we face today?
Under this program, this one is actually pretty expedited and gives much flexibility to the state of Louisiana. The state's got a great program in place, and looking forward to seeing additional progress.
So we should have much more control and be able to implement. All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My special guest, our Congressman Garret Graves. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Again, pleased to have back on the show our Louisiana Congressman Garret Graves. Garret, we were talking about kind of the tragic costs to our area of the flooding and the coastal erosion. You've got numbers on that stuff.
Well, with the flood we had in 2016, that flood alone, you can look back at job growth in the capital region in 2013, 2014. We had it ranges of 9,000 jobs to 12,000 jobs, new jobs in our region each year happening. Right. And in 2016, largely tied to the devastation of the flood on our area, we saw for the first time not a growth in jobs, not a growth in the economy, but actually a drop.
That's right.
And we lost several thousand jobs. In fact, some estimates project up to 5,000 jobs just right here in this area. We lost in 2016. Now the good news is that here in 2017, as we approach the end, we are seeing an uptick once again, showing some type of recovery. How much of that is the rebuilding versus real substantial foundational growth? We're going to have to wait and watch. But good news that we are seeing things begin to turn around, which certainly is good. But 2016, it was tough. It was a loss in growth. It was a loss in jobs, really having a big impact.
What has been the effect from your perspective on folks just saying, I've had enough, I'm out of here?
Well,
I was terrified for Livingston.
Well, you can go look. In fact, I've spent time talking to a lot of realtors and people who just gutted their homes and said, look, I'm selling as is. You're seeing demographics change in different areas, people who went in and bought these gutted homes. You're seeing people moving to different areas that maybe didn't flood or building now in higher areas. So you're seeing all sorts of changes. But the good news is, while we've seen bankruptcies and foreclosures and these homes that are being sold for pennies on the dollars because they flooded and are now gutted, the good news is that we have not seen this huge population drop. We've seen instead the population sort of redistributed. So we're hopeful that the people aren't going to leave here permanently, and we'll just see a sort of a redistribution of people around our
And I've
region.
talked with Sheriff Jason Ard, and he's confirmed that. I mean, Jason was there from the moment as you were, and he says it's rebounding. Yeah, he's great. So was Sheriff Sid Gotro. I mean, those guys and all our folks poured out their lives, frankly. Let's talk about, from an economic standpoint, how we are doing in Louisiana. I know there were some favorable rulings on lawsuits as it relates to oil and gas, but then I see Sasol shutting down $13 billion investment in Lake Charles. Tell me what the outlook is.
Well, look, first, we certainly still have, even though the Sasol decision on not moving forward on the gas to liquids.
And that has nothing to do with us. That's just because the price of gas tanked.
Yeah, as a quick sidebar, Shell was considering carrying out a similar project. And Shell looked at the economics of it for a couple of years and ultimately decided that they weren't going to move forward on the project. They never announced a project site or anything like that, but they just said that economics aren't right. Sasol kept moving forward, but now Sasol's saying that the economics aren't right based on current prices. So look, is losing a project of several $1 billion a setback? Absolutely, but I think you have to look at sort of the macro scale. Right now we have over $100 billion in projects in Louisiana that are on the books or underway. So we're still seeing some pretty impressive growth. Now, the bad news is that over the last few years, we've lost about 35% of our oil and gas workforce, one of the biggest sectors of the economy.
I did not know
and
that.
It has everything to do with the regulatory environment, it has to do with the prices, it has to do with the lawsuits and many contributing factors. But as you noted, one of the first lawsuits that was filed against a lot of these oil and gas producers, nearly 100 different companies, was ultimately thrown out and said that it largely lacked merit or standing. And so hopefully that is going to send a different message to some of the potential employers in this region that we're not going to see this new generation of lawsuits in this field, and that people can come here and continue to produce energy and help to fund help to power the nation. Now, something else that's interesting is that we used to, and we're still importing a good bit of energy, but now as these liquefied natural gas terminals are coming online, and Locke, I know you know this, but these terminals were initially built to import gas, and now they're all being turned around or built new to export gas. We have these shale plays, we have low abundant natural gas here in Louisiana and in the United States, so we're sending that gas to other countries around the world, and it is helping to recover some of the onshore energy production in the state of Louisiana. And lastly, in regard to this roughly $100 billion in economic development projects that are underway or on the horizon, a lot of those have to do with this sort of transformation of our economy. Low energy prices, while it's causing an impact on our exploration and production activities in some cases, it's causing this resurgence in manufacturing, not just in the United States, but right here in Louisiana. So low energy prices, great pipeline distribution system to get the energy around, and one of the best maritime transportation systems in the country with all of our ports and waterways here. So we are seeing the jobs come back. We've seen our unemployment rate go down. We've seen the number of jobs go up. So we're seeing some numbers that are improving, but with that big loss of nearly 35% of the oil and gas jobs in the state, we still have a ways to go.
Well, and one thing I've heard over and over is that sometimes the employers, when they move here, they can't really find the level of qualifications or training in the folks that we have here. So how do we solve that problem?
Well, you know, I think that there's been this growing divide for a number of years between our education system and the actual employment opportunities that are out there. But the good news is that things are beginning to come back together. I think that in our education system, to some degree, we told every student that got into grade school and high school that your end zone is a 4-year degree or an advanced degree. When the reality is, when you look at the actual jobs or employment opportunities that are available today, many of them require different certifications or technical degrees. And so we've seen our community and technical college system really stepping up and integrating themselves with the employers. I mean, it's impressive seeing what River Region's doing, seeing what Fletcher's doing, actually bringing the employers and the employers' equipment to their schools. They're teaching the classes to where when these people graduate or get their certification, they are going to their job the next day, and it looks just like they saw in the classroom.
They hit the ground running.
Absolutely. And so it's really amazing, Louisiana Calling and some of these other initiatives that's bringing things back together and truly preparing our students for the workforce that awaits them.
Now, I know that, and I can't believe it's already here, you got a re-election coming up again for your third term, as I recall, next November, is that right?
That's it, yeah.
So
I feel
November
like we just got here.
2018. And tell the folks what it's been like for you. I was going back reading kind of what your goals were for your first 2-year term and then your second 2-year term. And frankly, it looked like you kind of hit pretty much all the boxes.
We've stayed focused on the goals that we've set, and of course, those are all informed by the people that we're representing. Some of the frustrations with our traffic and transportation issues, we've been able to provide an estimated $500 million in increased transportation funds for the state. Restoring the coast, our bill became law that provides roughly an additional $100 million for the state. Working on trying to improve the regulatory environment, we've been able to work with the administration and through legislation, repealing about $80 billion in regulations, finding more efficient ways to achieve regulatory outcomes. So really just continuing to move forward. We have many other things, flood recovery we're working on, integrating technology, working on some food stamp and work reform ideas, then those are moving forward. So we have a lot of irons in the fire. We had one of our bills signed into law a few weeks ago by the president. So a lot of things moving right now, really excited.
And I don't know if folks know, but you worked for 2 senators in Congress, Tozan and Bro, and you've kind of taken advantage of those relationships that you developed over the years. It's a wonderful job.
Well, look, we had some great mentors, very, very helpful, and helped us to hit the ground running.
Great job.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you for being on the show. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My special guest, our Congressman Garret Graves. Thank you for being with us.